welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me, Episode 3, Build Up to War. Eric, can you tell us about Hitler's expansionism and how that led to the Second World War?
Hitler wanted to start expanding, and to start expanding by reoccupying the Rhineland. The Treaty of Versailles had taken that away from Germany, which had caused intense resentment because practically the whole population was German. But Hitler decided, when his armies had been built up to a certain size, that in fact he would reoccupy the Rhineland.
Which had become part of France after the First World War.
That's right. The story that was put around at the time was that if Hitler's troops had been stopped by one lone French policeman, then he'd given orders that the troops advancing into the Rhineland would have to retreat immediately. The actual reality was that the orders that he'd given to the German troops was that if the French army began moving forward to oppose them, then they should do a fighting retreat. However, the French troops stayed exactly where they were, made no opposition at all. There were no opposition expressed from other capitals, and so Hitler triumphantly absorbed the Rhineland.
When was it Hitler's army marched into the Rhineland?
On the 7th of March 1936, and then in 1938 he sent his bigger armies into Austria. Again, he made the excuse that the German population in Austria, of which there are very many, of course, were being oppressed by the government, and therefore he went in to defend them. But the newsreels at the time showed that there was no opposition, that Hitler's troops marched in to welcoming crowds along the streets, cheering and waving banners. People accepted that as proof of the Austrians' welcome for the German troops. Nowadays, we're probably more cynical and would think that perhaps all that had been organised for the cameras, rather than it being a spontaneous welcome by so many Austrians. And then there was a part of Germany that had been given to Czechoslovakia under the Treaty of Versailles. And there were many Germans in the border area called the Sudetenland. And Hitler wanted to move into there next. And that's what he did. There was again no opposition to it. The German population there welcomed them. The Czech government themselves were terrified because they built a line of forts along their new border with Germany. But by taking over the Sudetenland, Hitler leapfrogged all that, and so they were in the new German territory, so useless as a defence against the Germans anyway. The Germans had got possession of it. And also that was the main industrial area of Czechoslovakia, and so they lost that too. And what happened then was that Hitler, because he'd taken wanted that part of Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain went out to see him.
Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister.
That's right. And what the French and the British agreed was that Germany could reoccupy the Sudetenland and leave the rest of Czechoslovakia. And Hitler promised that the Sudetenland, was the boundary of his ambitions. He wasn't interested, he said, in occupying anywhere else. And if any disputes did arise, then they would solve them by agreement, by not going to war. And so Chamberlain came back to this country, waving his bit of paper as he got out of the aeroplane, bringing him back, and then in the House of Commons and saying, "It is peace in our time." And he was treated as a great hero
So how old were you at this time, and did you have any awareness of what was going on with Adolf Hitler?
No, I was probably 4.5. So all I knew was that when Chamberlain came back with his bit of paper and in the on the airfield, when he came out of the plane, then in the House of Commons declaring peace in our time, my mother burst into tears. Kitty, my older sister, and I couldn't make out what the man had said on the wireless, as radio was called in those days. Couldn't make out what my mother was crying about. And then my father came in. My mother said that Hitler had made this treaty with Chamberlain. He declared it was peace in our time, but she knew there would be war between Germany and Britain within a year. My father at first tried to convince her she got it the wrong way round, that it was peace, but my mother repeated her premonition. And of course she was right, because 6 months later, after the treaty, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then shortly after that he made an argument with Poland. We had given guarantees to Poland after Hitler had invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and it was war. If Hitler had been stopped at any of those earlier occasions, particularly on the first time of going into the Rhineland when he broke the Versailles Treaty blatantly, then Second World War would never have even happened, because he'd have lost his popularity in Germany, his standing would have been obliterated as far as the rest of the world were concerned, and the Germans would have almost certainly turned on him. But no one stopped him in the early stages.
Audio copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series via ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.